It was an ordinary day in the bustling courtroom, filled with the usual sounds of paperwork shuffling and murmurs from the crowd. The case before Judge Edward Turner was just another in a long line of cases that day. A teenager accused of theft. The defendant, 16-year-old Aaron Davis, stood in front of the bench, his hands nervously clenched at his sides. Aaron was no stranger to the system. He'd been in trouble before, but he was determined not to let his past define his future. As the prosecutor presented the case, Aaron stood quietly, his eyes glued to the ground. The evidence was flimsy at best. Witnesses who couldn't confirm his presence at the scene, a blurry security camera footage, and the claim that Aaron had been seen running from the store. The prosecutor seemed certain of the conviction, as if he had already decided Aaron's fate. Judge Turner, an experienced but somewhat jaded figure, listened intently as the prosecution made its arguments. He glanced over at Aaron, already forming an opinion about the boy standing before him. To the judge, this case was just another routine trial. He had seen plenty of young offenders like Aaron, and in his mind they all seemed to follow the same pattern. Poor choices, bad influences, and ultimately, a life heading toward the wrong path. Aaron's defense attorney, a young woman named Clara Williams, had barely made it through law school. She was still finding her footing in the courtroom, and it showed. Her arguments lacked conviction, and she was visibly nervous, glancing at her notes more than once. Aaron couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The judge, the prosecutor, even his attorney. Everyone seemed to expect the worst from him. He didn't have much confidence in the outcome of the trial. Judge Turner, who had been quietly observing Aaron, raised an eyebrow as the teenager's defense began. The boy didn't seem to have much to say in his own defense, and Clara's shaky arguments didn't seem to be doing much to help. The judge was ready to move forward, and he couldn't help but make a snide comment. "Let's wrap this up quickly. We all know where this is heading," Judge Turner muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. He turned to Aaron and added, "If you're hoping for some miracle, you might want to reconsider. You don't look like the kind of kid who's going to get away with this one." The room fell silent. Everyone was waiting for Aaron to respond, to offer some defense or explanation for what had happened. But instead he stood there, calm and composed, staring straight ahead. The judge's mocking tone only added to the tension in the courtroom. What no one expected, though, was what happened next. Aaron, his face still expressionless, took a step forward. Without any hesitation, he spoke with a clear and confident voice that seemed to catch everyone off guard. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm not just some kid you can dismiss. I'm not the person you think I am." Judge Turner scoffed. "Oh, really? And who exactly are you then? What is this? Some sort of last-minute defense you've come up with?" Aaron smiled slightly. "Actually, I'm a lawyer. A pretty good one, too. You see, I've been trained in law for the past year, and I've been practicing under a mentor who's one of the top defense attorneys in the country." The courtroom fell dead silent. The judge blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of what he had just heard. Aaron continued, his voice steady and confident as he elaborated. "I've been preparing for this case for weeks. I've researched the evidence, looked through all the legal precedents, and even reviewed your past rulings, Judge Turner," Aaron said, his gaze never leaving the judge's. "I know exactly what's going on here, and I'm not going to let this trial go on without challenging the unfair assumptions that have been made against me." The judge's expression faltered, the smugness that had been present earlier replaced by a flicker of doubt. "You've been training in law?" Judge Turner asked, his tone now more cautious. "And you think you can outsmart me in my own courtroom?" Aaron nodded, and in that moment, something changed in the air. What had started as a simple trial for a teenager accused of theft had now turned into a much bigger showdown. The room seemed to shift, and even the judge could feel the pressure building. He had been expecting an easy case, a quick verdict, but now he realized that he was dealing with someone far more capable than he had initially thought. The defense attorney, Clara, was in shock. She had no idea Aaron had been preparing himself for this trial. She had never expected him to be anything more than the quiet teenager who was just going through the motions of his case. But here he was, challenging the system, challenging the very judge who had already written him off as just another criminal. The prosecutor, now looking visibly uncomfortable, glanced between Aaron and Judge Turner, unsure of how to proceed. The judge, still in disbelief, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The game had just changed, and for the first time in the trial, he was no longer the one in control. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and everyone was waiting for the next move. Judge Turner, trying to regain control of the situation, cleared his throat and looked at Aaron with a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "So, you claim to be a lawyer. I must admit, I didn't expect this kind of surprise today. But it doesn't change the fact that you're still facing charges," he said, attempting to assert his authority. Aaron didn't flinch. He knew this was far from over, and if anything, this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. "Your Honor, I'm not here to play games. I'm here to ensure that the truth is heard," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "This case is built on assumptions and misunderstandings, and it's time we correct those before any more damage is done." Clara, the defense attorney, was still recovering from the shock of Aaron's revelation. She had no idea he was capable of something like this. She quickly glanced at the judge, hoping he would offer some kind of leniency, but the look on his face showed no sign of backing down. "I'm not going to let this courtroom become a circus," Judge Turner muttered under his breath, though it was clear the situation was already beyond his control. The prosecutor, still trying to compose himself, stood up, his voice rising as he addressed the judge. "This is ridiculous," the prosecutor exclaimed. "There's no way this kid, could possibly have the knowledge to challenge us in a court of law. This is a waste of everyone's time." He shot an angry glare at Aaron, clearly frustrated by what was happening. But Aaron wasn't intimidated. "I'm not a child, and I'm not here to waste anyone's time. I'm here to make sure that justice is done, and if you think I'm just some naive kid who can't understand the law, then you've completely underestimated me," he shot back, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and even the spectators seemed to be holding their breath. The judge's expression hardened as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Enough. We will proceed with the trial as planned. But mark my words, I won't let this turn into some kind of mockery." Aaron, however, was undeterred. He had already done his research, and he knew that the case against him wasn't as solid as the prosecution had led everyone to believe. He had spent countless hours reviewing every detail, finding inconsistencies in the witness statements, and identifying gaps in the evidence. And now he was ready to use that knowledge to fight for his freedom. The prosecution was relentless in their arguments, but Aaron's responses were sharp and precise, countering every claim with an argument rooted in legal principles and facts. It was clear that he wasn't just some teenager with a limited understanding of the law. He was a force to be reckoned with. The judge, who had initially dismissed Aaron as just another troubled youth, was beginning to realize that he was facing someone who was far more than he had expected. His brow furrowed as he listened to Aaron's arguments, and for the first time, he started questioning whether he had been too quick to judge the teenager. Aaron's defense was meticulous, challenging the prosecution's evidence and highlighting the flaws in their case. The more he spoke, the more it became clear that he wasn't just defending himself. He was holding the system accountable. His ability to think critically and apply the law with such precision shocked everyone in the room, especially Judge Turner. As the trial continued, Aaron's confidence grew. He had already made a significant impact by revealing his legal expertise, and now he was determined to see the case through to the end. The prosecutor, once so confident in their victory, now found themselves scrambling to keep up with Aaron's brilliant arguments. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. The same judge who had mocked Aaron earlier was now listening carefully, considering every word the teenager said. And as the session adjourned, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. No one knew how this trial would end, but one thing was clear: Aaron Davis was no ordinary teenager. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had turned into a battleground of wits, strategy, and law. The prosecution, which once held complete confidence, was now struggling to keep up with the unexpected challenge presented by Aaron Davis. The young man, barely old enough to drive, was systematically dismantling their arguments piece by piece. Judge Turner sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his once condescending smirk now completely gone. He studied Aaron with narrowed eyes as if seeing him in a new light. "All right, Mr. Davis," he said, his tone shifting from mockery to a cautious neutrality. "Since you seem to have a grasp on the law, let's put your knowledge to the test." The prosecutor, still rattled by how the case was unfolding, slammed his hand down on the table. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We are letting a minor play lawyer in a court of law. This is not how the justice system works." Aaron didn't even flinch. He turned to the prosecutor and calmly replied, "With all due respect, sir, the justice system works by ensuring fair trials, does it not? If I have the knowledge and the evidence to prove my innocence, should it really matter how old I am?" A murmur spread across the courtroom. The spectators leaned in, intrigued by the battle unfolding before them. Even some of the jury members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the young man's composure. The judge exhaled deeply before responding. "Proceed, Mr. Davis. But understand this. If you're going to defend yourself, you'd better be prepared to play by the rules." Aaron nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Your Honor." The cross-examination begins. Aaron stepped away from the defense table and walked confidently to the witness stand, where Officer Reynolds, the key witness against him, sat. The officer had been the one to arrest Aaron, and his testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Aaron adjusted his suit jacket, borrowed from his older cousin for this very occasion, and looked Officer Reynolds straight in the eye. "Officer Reynolds, you stated in your report that you arrested me at approximately 8:45 p.m. on the evening of June 10th. Is that correct?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, that's correct." "And you also stated that you pursued me for 5 blocks on foot before I was taken into custody?" "That's right." Aaron walked over to the evidence table and picked up a folder. He pulled out a printed document and held it up. "This is a traffic camera recording from the exact intersection where you claim to have started chasing me. The timestamp on this footage reads 8:49 p.m., 4 minutes after you claim to have arrested me." A hush fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor's face paled as he scrambled through his notes. Officer Reynolds shifted again in his seat, suddenly unsure of himself. Judge Turner leaned forward, his interest fully piqued. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Davis, that the arresting officer's testimony is inconsistent with the evidence?" Aaron nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The footage proves that Officer Reynolds wasn't even in pursuit at 8:45 p.m., as he stated in his report, which means—" He turned back to the officer. "Either your memory is incorrect, or your report was falsified." The weight of Aaron's words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. The prosecution's star witness had just been caught in a contradiction, and everyone knew that could unravel the entire case. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an attempt to discredit a law enforcement officer based on a mere technicality." Judge Turner raised his hand to silence the room. His expression was unreadable. "Objection overruled. This is not a technicality. This is a major inconsistency in a sworn testimony. Officer Reynolds, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Reynolds looked around the room, his face growing red. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that his case was starting to collapse. Aaron didn't let up. "One more thing, Officer Reynolds," he continued. "You also stated that I was in possession of stolen property when I was arrested. But according to police records—" He pulled out another document. "The item in question was recovered 2 miles away from where I was arrested. Can you explain how that's possible?" The courtroom exploded into murmurs. The jury members were whispering amongst themselves. Judge Turner tapped his gavel to restore order. "We need an answer, Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying a newfound seriousness. The officer swallowed hard, sweat visible on his brow. The once solid case against Aaron was crumbling, and everyone in the room could feel it. Aaron took a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting against a system that had tried to dismiss him before he even had a chance to speak, and he wasn't done yet. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Officer Reynolds, who sat stiffly in the witness chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the edges of the seat. Judge Turner removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. He was no longer the arrogant authority figure mocking Aaron. Now he was a man who realized that something was very wrong with the case in front of him. Aaron didn't hesitate. He stepped closer to the officer, his confidence unwavering. "Officer Reynolds," he said slowly, "your entire testimony is built on a report that now appears to be full of inconsistencies. If I wasn't arrested at 8:45 p.m., as you stated, if the stolen item wasn't even near me when I was taken into custody, then tell me, how exactly did I commit this crime?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The jury was leaning forward, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The prosecutor frantically flipped through his papers, looking for anything that could salvage the case. Judge Turner exhaled sharply. "Officer Reynolds, I expect a response. Immediately." The officer shifted uncomfortably, then finally muttered, I, I don't recall." A gasp rippled through the room. Aaron smirked slightly. "You don't recall? Interesting, because in your report, you wrote this incident down with complete certainty. But now that evidence is proving your version of events to be false, you suddenly don't recall?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. He was trapped. The prosecutor jumped up again. "Your Honor, this entire exchange is a distraction. We're here to determine the defendant's guilt, not put a police officer on trial." Judge Turner, however, was no longer on the prosecutor's side. He narrowed his eyes. "On the contrary, counselor, this young man has provided substantial evidence that suggests we may be looking at a wrongful prosecution. If Officer Reynolds cannot defend his own testimony, then I have serious concerns about this case." The prosecutor fell silent, his face growing red. Aaron turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, at this point, I believe we have enough reasonable doubt to dismiss this case entirely." Judge Turner glanced toward the jury, then toward the prosecutor. He sighed deeply, as if realizing just how wrong he had been about Aaron from the beginning. "I will need a moment to review the facts," the judge said, tapping his fingers on the bench. "But I must admit, Mr. Davis has raised significant concerns about the credibility of the prosecution's case." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. Aaron felt his pulse quicken. He was so close. But before the judge could speak again, something unexpected happened. Officer Reynolds, still seated in the witness stand, suddenly stood up. His eyes darted around the room, sweat dripping down his forehead. Then, in a voice filled with frustration and panic, he blurted out, "All right, I admit it. I made it all up." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. Judge Turner froze, his gavel halfway raised. The jury members looked at each other in shock. Aaron stood motionless, barely able to believe what he had just heard. Officer Reynolds clenched his fists and continued, his voice shaky but growing louder. "The case was weak. We had no real evidence. The higher-ups just wanted a conviction, and I followed orders." The entire courtroom was now in chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously on their notepads. Spectators gasped and shouted. Judge Turner slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" But nothing could calm the storm that had just been unleashed. Aaron Davis had done the impossible. He had exposed a corrupt case in front of the entire court, and now everything was about to change. The courtroom was in absolute chaos. The judge's gavel pounded against the wood, demanding order, but the murmurs, gasps, and frantic whispers wouldn't stop. A police officer had just admitted to fabricating evidence in an open court. This wasn't just a shocking revelation, it was career-ending. Aaron stood still, his heart racing. He had known something was off from the start, but even he hadn't expected Officer Reynolds to break under pressure like that. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear, his face flushed with embarrassment. Judge Turner, still gripping his gavel tightly, turned to Officer Reynolds with a glare so sharp it could cut steel. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice cold, "do you understand the gravity of what you've just admitted?" The officer swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered. The judge shook his head in disgust before looking toward the prosecutor. "And you? Did you know about this?" The prosecutor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Your Honor, I had no idea." Judge Turner didn't let him finish. "Enough. This trial is over." He turned his attention back to Aaron, who stood tall and unshaken. "Mr. Davis, not only do I find you not guilty, but I also commend you for the way you handled yourself in this courtroom today. You exposed corruption in a case that never should have existed in the first place. The audience erupted in applause. Even some jury members nodded in approval. Aaron took a deep breath, relief washing over him. He had done it. Judge Turner continued, his voice filled with authority. Officer Reynolds, you are hereby placed under immediate investigation for misconduct and perjury. Prosecutor Daniels, I will be recommending that this case, and every other case you've handled with Officer Reynolds, be reviewed for possible wrongful convictions. The prosecutor slumped in his seat, knowing his career was over. Then Judge Turner looked back at Aaron. For the first time that day, his expression softened. You have a bright future ahead of you, young man. Perhaps one day I'll see you back in this courtroom. On the bench. Aaron smirked. Maybe sooner than you think, Your Honor. Laughter and applause filled the courtroom as Aaron turned to his family, who rushed to embrace him. His mother had tears in her eyes, his father beamed with pride, and his friends cheered. As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, asking questions about his future, about justice, about how a teenager had just outsmarted an entire legal system. Aaron simply smiled and said, "This was just the beginning."
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.